Simply a word about Scott. If you have not gotten to know Scott, he has been with us since day one as we've made this transition toward more blended music. And you just need to know a little bit about his story to kind of fit what he was singing about. Fortunately, he outmarried himself. He's got a great wife, and he's got twins that are getting ready to graduate from high school, Joshua and Caleb. And he told me personally that he was hoping by the time they graduate, he could tell them apart. So we're hopeful that you can do that now, Scott. No, I hope you'll, if you haven't gotten to know Scott, you will. And the best laid plans, always. I meant to mention the inserts. Please take time to look at your VBS insert, and I would encourage half of you at least to sign up, so look at those seriously. Also, it's deacon time. If a person is in our church, they're a member, been a member for a year, they are eligible to be on that list of nominations there at the bottom. And so you see the ones that are presently serving, so don't choose those. Obviously, they're already serving. But those that are eligible to return are there as well. So hopeful that's easy. It's also NKBA, or Associational Week. You should have received an envelope in there that looks like this. I saw that you, in fact, received one that looks like this. If you filled this one in, our hope is that that offering will go to the Northern Kentucky Baptist Association. We already give regularly to them, but this is a special offering given this week. We'll probably have that in there next week. And Jim Willems, who is a friend of mine and a friend to our association, he is our associational director, will be here on Monday? Tuesday? Nancy, which one of those? Tomorrow, thank you. My brain just went south on me. If you watch the challenges and the egotism that operates around corporate America, you know that corporations sometimes act like what we would call love-struck teenagers, because they want to acquire objects of their affections, usually one powerful company lusting after a smaller, perhaps sexier one. Sometimes, however, the partnership between the two desperate lost souls who are trying to find their way together. So we talk today about mergers, acquisitions. Not only does it happen in large companies, but even in teenage social outings. And I'm not sure the difference sometimes between the two. You've seen the good mergers and the bad mergers if you have been tuned in. Sometimes the marriage can be like between a fairy tale story between two, the world of Disney and Pixar. You remember a number of years ago, two great entertainment companies came together in a partnership and largely resulted in a license to, I would consider, to print money, because they have been incredibly successful. But on the other hand, the marriage might look like something between Exxon and Mobil, which is a remarriage of old companies, and it turns out to be a kind of 19th century Rockefeller company, and it creates, in fact, the largest corporation in the world. The New York Central and Pennsylvania Railroads did that a number of years ago. Some of you weren't old enough to remember, but back in 1968, the face of declining rail travel was out there, and so those two large entities came together, and it effectively killed large-scale passenger rail travel in the United States. The one that almost all of us will remember, because it was a techie kind of merger, was Time Warner and AOL. You'll remember they merged with great fanfare, only to crash and burn in about 10 years. I looked through the articles that were about that merger this week, and one of the articles listed 5 reasons for their failure. And the one that I pulled out that I thought was interesting was leaders were convinced that they had the answers and were not willing to change course. Amen and amen. If we are in a world whereby we are going to choose to live effectively and make a difference long term, we've got to decide that we will be people who will be wise enough to change when we need to and wise enough to stay the same. So we're going to talk a little today about Jesus's final word about acquisitions and mergers. It's found in the end of what I would call the red letter section in the Gospel of John. If you've read the Gospels, you know that the last Gospel written was the book of John. And so of all the ones that were the most reflective of what was going on, it would be John. And so John has Jesus reflecting chapters 14 through 17 in a very powerful way. But it's 17. As a matter of fact, it's the last verses there that we're going to look at. It's John 17. You won't see them on the screen. I'm just going to read those because I want you to let it sink in. John 17, verse 20. My prayer is not for them alone. Them being those that are going to come after us. He says, I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message. In other words, that's you and me. We are the ones that have come after, and Jesus is saying, I want those that come after me to live their lives in such a way that through their message, people will come to know you, and that all of them may be one. Father, just as you are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. I've given them the glory that you gave me, that you may be one as we are one. I in them and you in me, so that they may be brought to complete unity. Then the world will know that you sent me and that have loved them even as you have loved me. Father, I want those who have given me to be with me where I am, and to see my glory, the glory you have given me because you have loved me before the creation of the world. Righteous Father, though the world does not know you, I know you, and they know that you have sent me. So I've made you known to them and will continue to make you known, in order that what? The love you have for me may be in them, that I myself may be in them. So this is Jesus' final kind of what we call the high priestly prayer, his final prayer. It is that final section where the people have gathered there to be with his disciples, and so they are there receiving word together at their big meal, that the big meal being the Passover. And so if you follow the book of John, you get to this point, you're just so moved by what he's saying, but you also need to know what follows. Because if you read on, you know that then things begin to fall apart. The temple police show up and Jesus is arrested. And so we look at those 7 verses, the final conclusion being that the witness of the church might be that they will in fact bear fruit. All through the Gospel of John, you will find an inclination drawing yourself to the issue of oneness. Over and over again, John is consumed. Now, why do you think he would be consumed with oneness? If he, in fact, is the last of the Gospels, and we believe that he is, the further you get away from the event of Christ, the less settled people are. The more you get away from him, the less experience you remember, the less warm-hearted stuff's going on, so you're likely to get a little, well, let's do it a different way, this way, this way, this way, or this way. And so even from early on, at the end of the Gospel, what we're having here is John talking about, before Paul even gets his words out, John talking about how we need to be one. I looked back through it. Jesus and the Father are one. Jesus desires all those who come to faith as one. There is one flock he talks about over and over again. There is one shepherd he talks about. Even when he talks about his robe, it is a seamless robe, talking about the wholeness of it. Even when he talks about this net over in chapter 21, he talks about a net that is untorn. And so all of those are images that John's giving us to talk about how connected we are to that. So if you got your folder and want to follow along, we're going to kind of move quickly because we want to end with the 3 points that we have there in that final one. But why are mergers so difficult? I kept thinking, what is it? When you put people together of all sorts, and you've had social clubs that you've been involved in, whether it be, and obviously you've been involved in church, but why are mergers so difficult? Experts tell us that there are a lot of reasons. There can be anything from poor communication to simply a lack of due diligence. They didn't research this union very well and a lack of a shared vision. But it seems to me the biggest reason is the inability to bring these two cultures together. And so employees get used to doing it one way, church members get used to doing it one way. And so when we try to hold on to this partnership, sometimes it is not so easy. The best mergers, on the other hand, do what I would call the relational math right. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. But in a bad merger, 1 plus 1 often equals 2, and that means two cultures that are very different will not choose to be together, and so what you have is 1 plus 1 equals 2, and the two are always going to be 2, and so you never really have a kind of coming together or unifying. But then there's the other kind that comes together, 1 plus 1 equals 1.5, and that's when actually one part is devalued, the other part is valued, and so the other part always feels undervalued. But the best mergers, they tell me, is 1 plus 1 equals 3. And what that means is that the one gives up some of theirs, the one gives up some of theirs, and they come together and they are something different. They are something different and better together. And that has a little bit of gospel in it, but there's even one step further than that. Why are mergers difficult? For all those reasons. So what is the relational math of merging, at least spiritually merging? Jesus was a master of that kind of relational math. He said of these 12 men that needed to come together, he took their desires from different places, their expectations, they were all different, and their cultures, and he wanted to bring them together so that through their word, you and I would come to know Christ. Now, think for a moment of the incredible power and value of words. Think about it. You say, well, words don't matter. Oh, yes, they do. Words matter. They matter incredibly. Now, they matter most when we can match our words with our actions, but words are incredibly important. They are ultimately the part of us that people first understand and last almost always hear. Jesus said in verse 21, we read it a moment ago, as you, Father, are in me, I am in you. May they also be in us so that the world may believe. And so what he's saying here is that if we really want to be like Jesus, then we need to understand Jesus' word about the Trinity, and that is that there is within the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit a kind of unity that says 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 1. It does. Because the Trinity is all one. You know about that. It's the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. And he's saying the very nature of our relationship is most clearly identified when people that know me act like that. It means 3 different kinds of manifestations, but they function as one. So let's spend the rest of our time on question number 3, though. How do we do the relational work of merging together? Well, first of all, we got to understand how difficult it is. Of all the things I've done in my lives as a minister, the most difficult thing I do on a daily basis is keep the ship, keep the church focused in a way and unified in a way that we can all move forward. I know how to run a ship that nobody complains much. I do. I can run a ship pretty easily. I can marry and bury and do all the things that go along with that. But the first time I, as pastor, bring change, oh my goodness. From that very first year, I told you about that experience when I didn't understand the culture. Fortunately, I had a deacon who, I loved Norman. He had a glass eye, and you never knew where Norman was looking sometimes because of that glass eye. But he was the best man, one of the best men I've probably ever known. I went back years ago and did his funeral, but I remember, and I've mentioned to you, the little lady in our church, that we had made a decision that we were going to get new pews. And I just a first-time pastor, part-time church on the weekends, and so that sounded simple to me. I mean, it was going to cost $17,000 for those pews. Now, $17,000 to a little part-time church, that's That's a chunk of money. It's probably more than they were paying me at the time, if I remember right. But nevertheless, we decided we were going to do that. And my friend Norman came to me and he said, now, Dan, Miss So-and-so is the gossip of the church. He just laid it right out. She's the gossip of the church. He said, she's the reason we no longer have party lines in this county, because she always was gossiping. So you need to know that if you want something done, you need to work through her, not around her. I said, what do you mean by that? He said, put her in charge of raising money for the pews. And that sounded like the worst idea I ever heard. First of all, I'd already heard she was against it. Well, she didn't want those old, beautiful, awful-looking pews moved. She didn't care if ladies in the church told me weekly that they were getting their hose torn up on those pews. She wanted those old pews until we put her in charge. Well, she got on that phone, and within 10 days, we had raised, through commitments, $17,000 for those pews. The best part of it, they paid it, and we have those pews. And Neva and I are going back there in June to be with them on an anniversary. Now, what do I mean by that? There was a lady who wasn't perfect in any sense of the word. I had a deacon who was incredibly wise, and I was wise enough to listen to that deacon. And so what we did was move forward. Very imperfect people made a really good decision together because we looked at our culture, we looked at our connectedness to one another, and we did what was right. A guy by the name of Arthur Burns, go back and look him up in history sometime. He's chairman of the United States Federal Reserve System. Didn't know about him until I read the book by Os Guinness called The Call. In there, he talks about this very reserved, very bright, intelligent guy who served not only as the chairman of the Federal Reserve, but also as an ambassador to West Germany. Very distinguished looking man, served under two presidents, Dwight Eisenhower and Ronald Reagan. But he also, interestingly, was Jewish. And when he began attending an informal White House group prayer meeting, some of the folks in the prayer meeting got a little nervous. You know, well, we got a Jew in this meeting. And so at the end of the meeting, every week, one member would be called upon to pray, just a normal kind of part of the process. But everybody in the group knew that, you know, you really shouldn't ask Arthur to pray, you know, him being Jewish and everything. So they stayed away from that until one day they had a newcomer lead the meeting, and sure enough, at the end of the meeting, not knowing any better, he looks over at Arthur and he asks him to pray, and everybody in there has a collective gasp because, oh, what is he going to say? What is he going to say? This is what he said. Lord, I pray that you would bring Jews to know Jesus. He says, I pray that you would bring Muslims to know Jesus. And most of all, Lord, I pray that you would bring Christians to know Jesus as well. Now, what's he saying? He's saying it's difficult, isn't it? It's difficult to claim Christ and to walk together unified. And he knew that. He knew that. He had watched enough in Washington, certainly, to know that it is difficult. Secondly, we understand that unity is based upon a posture and not a position. Let me give you an image of that. A posture is open hands. Come to me. I'm open to receive you. Have you ever walked down a hall or come into a room and people turned away? That doesn't feel so good, does it? It means something about a position I've taken or a position you've taken or a position they've taken means that they want to be right. But Christ just forces us to look at his posture. And what Jesus says in this passage is, the Father's posture to me is loving Father. So how can I not be loving Son? So what is your posture? What is your posture? Thirdly, he says we must understand that unity is based upon reflection and not correction. Isn't it nice when you pass the point of a relationship that you have with a child, with a friend, with whoever it might be, with a father or a mother, where you pass the level of correction and you do reflection together? Like I told you last week that we parents and grandparents, we bite our lips because we don't, always say what we think. And by the way, if you are still doing that, I have a class that you need to go to and get yourself straightened out. You do not need to say everything that you know. And so, it's best to reflect rather than simply correct all the time. I listened to Greg with Eli this morning in the office. I was sitting there looking over my notes, and Eli, how old is Eli now? 4? Almost 4, going on 14. So Eli's hanging out with his dad this morning, and I noticed what Greg was saying to Eli. He wasn't saying, do this, or do this, or do this. He was saying, why don't we do this? Why don't we do that? Now, was he going to make sure that he did it? Sure, but he was saying, let's go on the elevator, or let's do this, or why don't you eat your sandwich, or, those kinds of things. What he was doing was leaning into reflection as opposed to correction. Who wants to be corrected? I would rather be reflected upon, given me an option. And unity will include the fact that if I always have to be correct, then I will never really be connected. So how does he reflect on all this? He says in verse 22, the glory that you have given me, I have given them so that they may be one as we're one. Now, what's that word glory? I kept thinking about that word. Glory is the major theme that John uses. And he basically says that Jesus uses it here to describe both what he has received from the Father, but also what he has given you and me. Now, what does that mean? How can I make sense of that? Well, we are God's reflected glory. It doesn't mean that we'll ever be totally right. My wife told me the other day she was looking in a mirror and it didn't make her look as good as she looked. Now, this is when you learn the beauty of silence. No words. No words. I said, let's reflect on that, hon. What does that mean? In a perfect world, we never reflect God's glory perfectly. We just don't, do we? We're always going to be a little bit off center from that. But he says, do it as best you can do it. He says, this is my commandment, that you love one another as I've loved you. I've made your name known to them, and I will make it known so that you love with which you have loved me. Now, let me give you the image that I kept conjuring up last night. Neva got home we were split last night. She went to a celebration of a graduate in our church and a family in our church, and she got the fun part. Well, I mean, my part was fun, too. I did a wedding on the other side of town, and so I missed that. But she began telling me how our 2-year-old grandson acted. This was a very big celebration, and there was music, and all of a sudden, Holden forgot where he was and started dancing like a wild man. And she told me, and then she showed me some videos of this young man, and he was playing instruments, but the thing that he kept doing over and over again that I thought was interesting is he would go play an instrument and dance a little bit, and he would run and hug Nona and just love her. And I kept thinking, think about that. What if we responded to God's music in our lives with dancing? That we just enjoyed God's music, and every so often we ran over to him and gave him the glory. Nona, thanks for bringing me here. I'm having the time of my life. Lord, thanks for giving me life. Thanks for giving me my church. I'm going to give God glory. Now, I'm going to work with Neva on her being God in this image later, but you know what I'm saying. The reasons that Tom Rainer gives for churches that are not unified, he gives 14 of them. Let me run through them real quickly. He says there's gossip, there's failure to confront church bullies, there's a lack of prayer, there's adopting a hypersensitive spirit, no church discipline, there's a fear of losing members, and then there's the power groups. Those are just a few. I read across an old letter, like a real old letter, 2nd century letter, written by an unknown author to a person called Diogenes. And he was trying to talk about how Christians are different than those in the world. And notice what he says. He says, Christians are indistinguishable from other people either by nationality, language, or custom. In other words, that's not what distinguishes them. He says they do not inhabit separate cities of their own or speak to strange dialect or follow some outlandish way of life. With regard to dress and food and manner of life, they follow the customs of whatever city that happen to be living in, whether Greek or foreign. But notice what he says, and yet there is something extraordinary about their lives. They live in their own countries as though they were only passing through. They play their full role as citizens, but they labor under all the disabilities of aliens. Any country can be their homeland, but for them, their homeland, wherever it may be, it is a foreign country. Like others, they marry and they have children, but they do not kill them. They share their meals, but they do not share their wives. They live in the flesh, but they are not governed by the desires of their flesh. They pass their days upon this earth, but they are citizens of heaven. They are obedient to the law, but they live on a level that transcends the law. Isn't that interesting? He says, finally, to speak in general terms, we may say that the Christian is to the world what the soul is to the body, as the soul is present in every part of the body while remaining distinct from it. So Christians are found in the cities of the world, but cannot be identified with the world. You and I both know that we live in a tumultuous time. Political turmoil all around us. But you and I, what matters most is that you and I believe, whether we believe the present administration is right or whether it's wrong, what matters the most is not what they think of him or even us. What matters the most is what people think of Jesus. Because you know what? The world judges Christians, judges Christ by Christians. And that's the scariest, most exciting thing I can possibly tell you. We get judged not by who we are, but by whose we are. There's a saying that a friend of mine says every Sunday. If he writes me, he'll almost always say this as an encouragement today. He says, Dan, make much of Jesus. Let's do that.